Effective courses are outcome driven, but most new course creators shoot themselves in the foot from the start by falling victim to a very common myth about how they should build their course curriculum. So I'm Alexandra Allen, and I'm a learning designer and project manager, and today I'm going to walk you through how you can create an intentional, effective learning experience that helps you achieve student outcomes. So I have a number of slides I'm going to walk you through with some visuals, but otherwise feel free to drop any questions you have in the comments and I'd be happy to respond to them. And if you find value in this video, I would appreciate any likes to help me boost engagement. Thanks. Now let's get into it.
Okay, so how to create outcome-driven courses. So now we're going to do two things together. First, we're going to look at what is the biggest myth about building a course curriculum, why it's a myth, and why you should avoid it at all costs, despite people on social media claiming this is the go-to way to build a course curriculum. And then secondly, we're going to look at what is the go-to framework for building an effective outcome-driven course curriculum, why it's important, and how you can use it. So I gave a quick background to myself at the start, but again, I'm Alexandra. I'm an online course designer and trainer. I've worked on some course accelerators like the Maven Course Accelerator and with some big name creators like the Rite of Passage team. And before that, I worked at a startup hub called District 3. And my background's in learning design and tech, but actually for the bulk of my career, before I transitioned into that, I was a project manager. So I think that's where my love of organization and creating structure originally manifested in my career. And I'm based I work remotely from Montreal, Canada, but I've also lived in London, Sydney, and Paris, and I continue to work with clients around the world. So wherever you're tuning in from, I appreciate you checking out this video. And if you take value out of what we're about to cover, then I would greatly appreciate a like or comment to help me boost engagement. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to post them and I'd be happy to answer them. So quick poll question before I get into this big myth around building effective courses. So I want to know, have you ever been in this situation? And normally I throw this up as a poll question in a live workshop I run. And I ask people, think about your work experience, over the duration of your career. And think about any time, whether you've been starting a new job or, training someone, onboarding someone into a new job, or just like learning something new or teaching someone else something new on the job. Have you as, the trainer or trainee, if you will, ever been in a situation where things started off great, you were hitting it off with the person training you or who you were training, you were going through things and, all was flowing well. And then as you got towards the end, whether it was the last few days or the last few hours, you suddenly noticed a shift in the vibe where either you as the trainer or trainee or vice versa started feeling really stressed of, oh my God, we still have so much to cover. And then all of a sudden it became this race to get everything done when up until that point it had been pretty relaxed, pretty chill. So if you answer yes, I can relate to an experience where everything was going along hummingly and then all of a sudden it was like go, go, go and felt like we didn't have enough time and all stressed out. Then you're in like the 95% of people who usually respond, yes, I've been in that situation at least once. For many people, it's been more. And I'm always astonished by the 5% who said they've never encountered that. Pretty remarkable, but very cool. But I just want you to be in this mindset of, before I get into the myth about building effective curriculums, of most training experiences tend to run into this problem, specifically informal ones where it's on-the-job training, where it's kind of like, instead of just being like a canoe that's going along smoothly, it starts out smooth, but then it gets really turbulent as it nears the end, because all of a sudden people realize they didn't allocate enough time, they have too much to go over. And so it's this idea of how do you build a curriculum that creates balance and, a harmonious experience for people so that it's not, jerking all over the place of smooth and chaotic towards the end. Because really, the kind of peak end rule is people will remember, the experience largely based on how it finishes. So you want to make sure that it's a smooth experience throughout. So on that note, I'm going to get now into this myth about building course curriculum. So I see this a lot on Twitter, LinkedIn, you name it, but people who are not, learning designers or don't have, experience in this field say it's really simple to create a course. Just start with the first thing students should know. And then they say, oh yeah, then focus on the next thing and the next thing. But actually the expert point of view is that you should actually start with an outcome in mind, figure out where people are now, and based on how much time you have with them, figure out by working backwards, what's the quickest route to get students from point A to point B. And just to make this more concrete, I think about even in my career when I've been training people, let's say it's in project management, if there was someone who I was training for over a month, the experience and kind of training process I would follow, no matter how informal it was very different compared to someone who I had to train and, let's say, or just give tips on in roughly like 2 or 3 hours. So again, you could see even if they were in the same role, depending on how much time I had with them, I had to be hyper prioritize what we were going to cover. And this is where you really got to focus on the outcome and work backwards. And it's this idea of when you're building a course, the reason you want to be outcome driven is because you always want to be clear on what do people need to know and be able to do by the end of your time together, and then create an experience that's going to enable them to perform at that level, or that quality by the end of your time together. And then that informs what content you share with them, because a lot of people just overwhelm people with content with courses, when really it's about teaching people how to actually do stuff or use information in new contexts, not just giving them a ton of information to process on their own. So on that note, I want to talk about this concept of backward design, because ultimately backward design is this framework of working backwards from the outcome. So again, it's what do people need to know or be able to do by the end of the time together? And then how do you make sure that you're hitting all the right notes and not going off on some crazy solo, if you want to use a music analogy, but essentially going off on tangents that aren't crucial to getting them to that outcome. Because things that are nice to have are great for people who have more time, but you need to indicate what is nice to have, because when someone's new at something, they don't know what's essential versus what's nice to know, or potentially interesting to explore in the future. So it's your job to figure out what is the outcome, what are the essential actions that lead up to that by going backwards, and then anything else is needs to be clearly indicated as supplementary information. So this framework, backward design, is super helpful for doing that. And it was introduced by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe in their book Understanding by Design, which was first published in 1998, so it's been around a long time, and it's widely used across schools, specifically elementary and primary schools, but also widely adopted now just in general of helping students be outcome driven. So this is something that, again, you see this backwards arrow of, I want you to really kind of internalize this, because it's counterintuitive of start with the first thing people should know makes sense. But now I kind of want to walk you through a very basic example of why that's not effective. So let's say I have my teacup here. So we're going to make it really simple before we look at an actual curriculum of how this works. So imagine we're using backward design to make my cup of tea. So how it would work is, and I'm going to go through how it would work, and then I'm going to explain why starting from the first thing I would do normally wouldn't be effective. So the last step before enjoying my tea would be to add the milk or sugar. So depending on what people prefer, in my case it's just milk. But the idea is that's the last step before you can actually have the cup of tea. And then if you want to work backwards from there, if I had to teach someone how to create a cup of tea in a couple of minutes, this is what I would tell them. Okay, well, before you add your milk or sugar, you actually have to steep the tea for 2 minutes. So that's the essential step before that. Before that, you'd have to pour the water into the mug so that it could steep. So again, you see we're doing these essential steps of what you have to do, and then I'll just go through these quickly. But before the water, you'd have to put in your tea bag, and then you'd have to boil the water before that, and before that you'd have to pick your mug. So you can see that these are the essential steps. So now I have them 1 to 6. So I've worked backwards, and of course you're going to apply them in chronological order. So the person would start with pick the mug, boil the water. But the reason that it's not effective to think from the start, in most cases, is, let's say someone told me, okay, you have to teach someone how to make a cup of tea, and I started from the beginning. I would say okay, well, this is where you risk going off on a tangent. So when I think about picking a mug, I might say, oh, well, a really wide, shallow mug would lose heat faster than, I don't even know if that's true. I'm just making up examples here, versus a taller cup, or made of a different material. So I could go off on a tangent with that. And then same with boiling water. I myself have just a kettle where you flick the switch and then it goes, versus some people might say, oh, but you could also just boil water on the stove in a pot. And then when it comes to step 3, picking your tea bag, someone might start going off on a tangent about tisanes versus caffeinated teas and how to decide which one you want, and et cetera, et cetera. But the point is, when you do it this way, you risk going off on these tangents. Whereas if you go backwards, you understand, okay, this is the outcome I need to get to, where it's an actual action of pick a mug, boil water, put the tea in the mug, et cetera, not just okay, what tea do I want? Again, tisane versus caffeinated. So again, you're really safeguarding yourself from going off on these tangents. And again, if I were teaching someone how to make tea in 2 minutes or a minute, this is what I would tell them. But then if someone said, oh, I want you to spend a week teaching people how to make like a really great cup of tea, then I would reassess and say like, okay, well, in that case, maybe I will go into tisanes versus caffeinated teas, because I know people are really interested in like how to choose their flavor or like what type they want or like that sort of thing. And it's like you can add in those things by expanding it. So think of it like an accordion, but you have to start by really compressing it or like vacuum sealing it of what are the essentials, and then you can add in stuff depending on how much time you have. But at a minimum viable, I know that I need to cover these things. So hopefully that makes sense. Now to make it a bit more concrete for an actual course of how this works, I want to give an example based on a client I've worked on creating a project management course. So in this case, the woman I was speaking with, she told me, okay, I want to create a project management course. She was still kind of working out. She wasn't sure what it was going to be exactly, but she said, okay, this is what I'm thinking I should cover. So by this whole start with what students should know, she was like, okay, well, I should cover SMART goals. I should cover some project management softwares and of course some frameworks. I also think I should cover the characteristics of good project managers, et cetera, et cetera. So I was like, okay, whoa, pump the brakes for a second, because again, it becomes this like dumpster fire of ideas where you have to stop and remember, if it's taken you years to master your craft and then you're teaching a course to help other people step into at least similar footsteps, or at least put them on a pathway to doing that, you can't expect them to absorb everything you've learned in years of like working, probably like full-time hours on it within like 2 or 3 weeks, doing like a few hours here and there. So you have to be really strategic and understand that people can't process that much. They can't practice that much. So instead, what you want to do is get really specific on what do you want them, again, thinking of backwards design, of what do you want them to know or be able to do by the end of your time together. So this is where you see the big red kind of X of don't start with the first thing students know, because then you start doing this like brain dump of everything you could teach, and that's not helpful. Instead, what you want to do is use backward design. And then, so what I did here with her is I said, okay, so let's stop for a minute and think about, she was running a course for like her first cohort was 2 weeks. So, okay, what do you want people to do by the end of your time together? And she was actually teaching her team on how to like be better project managers. So she was saying, okay, well, I'm going to spend 2 weeks, and by the end, I want each of them to submit their project plan to me in Excel. So super basic, keeping it, light touch. It's more about the process. And she was saying, okay, and then I can give them feedback, but it's like they're going to leave this with a project plan that they can then carry forward and continue using to actually deploy their project. So I said, okay, well then if we work backwards from there, we know that in order for them to submit a project plan in Excel, they first have to be able to build a project plan in Excel. So you see, this is where we're going in like reverse chronological order. So this becomes the step immediately before that. And in order for them to build a project plan, they first have to be able to create a project timeline to get some high level, points of, okay, well, how are we going to go about this? And then in order to do that, beforehand, they'd have to create their SMART goals that would inform what is the timeline, et cetera. And then before they actually do that, first they have to come up with a project. So they have to decide on their project. So those become the concrete steps they have to take. So then it goes from like bottom to top, decide, create, et cetera, all the way up to submit. That then becomes her curriculum of what she needs to cover. So similar to the backward design one, the backward design example I showed, I'm just trying to click back to the T one. You can see like that, if I put it on the same thing, it would go backwards of what she's covering with them. So then all of a sudden she's like way more clear on, oh my God, this makes total sense. And I know like even things like project management software, she's like, that's something that I can cover with them after the fact. Once they have their project plan in Excel and they nail the process, then we can get into things like, okay, if we're going to start using a software as a team, what could we implement? What would be good? But the key thing is that's like too soon to bring in. So they don't need to know that. That's a nice to have after the fact. And then like characteristics of a good PM, that could be something in terms of, again, after the fact, talk about like, what do you need to be able to do? Or it could be worked into the start of deciding on their project and like what are some characteristics you need to keep in mind as a project manager? It could be like, content they look at before the course. But the point is we now have a clear pathway of what they need to do. And notice how all of these words, decide, create, build, submit, they're all action oriented. So this is again with your curriculum. A lot of people just start plugging in the content they're going to cover. But content is not helpful if it's not framed in like, what are people able to do with that information? So this is where, again, with backward design, you want to focus on what are the outcomes, the final outcome you're looking for being the submit project plan, but also then what are like the mini outcomes within that of the action steps they need to take to that end. And that's then all of a sudden you'll get clear on, okay, now I know what's essential versus what is nice to have. And maybe that's going to be like bonus content they could read during the course, after it. Maybe it's pre-reads or content they consume before it to get into the right mindset. But the point is, you see from left to right, like what a difference in terms of just starting with the first thing they should know and firing off all these things versus being action oriented and focusing on what is the outcome we're working towards. So just keep that in mind. Backward design, it's amazing. Whether you're, and again, just side note, whether it's a project management endeavor or like actually building your course or creating the learning experience, super effective. So the takeaway here is, again, just that most people, like I said, course creators and people in general, when they're doing trainings, is they focus too much on information transfer, but really you're trying to create a skill development and kind of set the foundation for that. So you want students to be able to apply what they're learning so that they can solve problems of your own. In the case of the project management one, they're going to take it forward and use their project plan to actually carry out a project. So backward design is the go-to framework for this to make sure you're outcome driven. So keep that in mind as you're constructing these experiences, because this is something that you just want to, always have top of mind and not just get swayed by, okay, start with the first thing and then add to it. That's also, as much as it can seem intuitive to start with the first thing, it's also our brain's way of kind of being lazy of when we don't want to commit to, okay, what is the overall forest to look like? We're like, okay, well, I'm just going to focus on the first step and then figure that out. So if you're creating a course, you really want to be clear on what does the learner experience look like, and then keep that top of mind. So now I just want you to think, as you're going out into the world and applying this, what's one thing you'll do differently now to make your course more outcome driven? And again, it could be as simple as employing backward design and setting a timer and running through what would my experience look like if I know this is what the outcome is and how could I work backwards. And one of the things I would caution you to bear in mind is often people overestimate what people can accomplish in a course. So chances are, if you're running a course for the first time, you're probably being a bit bold in your ambitions of what people will be able to complete by the end. Something like a project plan or something that's more minor versus, building out an entire project. That's obviously a lot heavier, but just keep that in mind. So what are you trying to help people kind of develop the foundation of by the end? And then how do you work backwards to make sure you're being more intentional? You're being intentional about your time together. So again, just want to say thanks for checking out this video. If you enjoyed it, would appreciate a thumbs up, comment, or any questions you have. And definitely subscribe to my channel. I'm going to be having more workshops like this. Again, kind of taking tidbits of workshops I normally run live. So you can get lots of tips about course creation and just building effective outcome-driven learning experiences. Thanks for watching.